big welcome to everybody participating. And it's just a thank you so much to all the hosts today. Of course, what's more important than what I have to say is what our esteemed panelists have to say today. I'm delighted to spend time with you and hearing the insights from Abinti, from Tanuja, from Kelly. But we really want to keep this interactive and we want to hear from you too. We want to make sure that we're addressing your answers and indeed that as you move on in the next 20, 30 minutes into your busy days and schedules, no doubt you have weighty and important responsibilities to undertake in this world. We want to make sure that we've left you with keys to be able to, as has been so eloquently said, more efficiently manage your impacts. And so I'm going to ask that you would consider in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a Q&A box. As questions come to you, please do post it in the Q&A box. I'll be watching that and passing that on to the panelists as the discussion proceeds. But without any further ado, I'm going to ask Mabinti to introduce herself first and share a little bit with us what for her has been significant in the integration between gender and racial inequality in the work she does at Live Africa. Thank you, Mabinti.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Monique. It's truly an honor to be here through the ANDE metrics from the ground up. I created Live Africa, which stands for Legacy Impact Venture Enterprises, with the intention to understand how impact is realized across sub-Saharan Africa. It was the intention to really understand more deeply the impact on African women and women across the value chain, and then a focus on how can we better serve historically marginalized communities. And that was the intent because there is a desire to measure impact. The GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network in ANDE, has done a lot of research to really raise awareness about the value of impact measurement and management. And even when prior to founding Live in Nairobi, Kenya, I was before in the US working at the GIN, where I served on the impact measurement and management team and supported the IRIS team, doing training on impact measurement and management with fund managers, and also really understanding what are some of the pain points experienced across the value chain. Previous to working at the GIN, I worked at the UN Foundation, working on public-private partnerships, looking at health gaps and disparity, especially in reproductive health, across emerging and frontier markets, and had the honor of being a consultant at the World Bank Group. I also serve on the Impact Capital Forum board, which used to be the Microfinance Club of New York. And it's truly an honor to work in this space, especially as there's so much heightened tension around gender equity, racial equity. And for considerations in terms of how we advance impact measurement and management is really digging deeper. When we talk about gender and talk about impact on women, it's not enough just to count numbers, but also understand that there's nuance. How are we impacting women of color? How does race and intersectionality impact the way women entrepreneurs get access to resources and financial capital? And so for us at Live Africa, it's about really surfacing really great insights and just looking across the spectrum, looking across the value chain. How deep are we going? What's the scale and what's the depth? And also bridging this gap that exists between investors and investees in terms of measuring impact. Are we measuring what matters? And so I think that's critically important to guide the work that we do in this space.
Thank you. That's so wonderful. And I'm going to ask Tanuja next to share a little bit about your background, your journey at WorldGrow, and perhaps share for us the capacity building work that you've done and how that's contributed to the successes that you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Monique. So my name is Tanuja, and I look after monitoring and evaluation at WillGrow. So WillGrow is essentially India and the world's oldest social impact incubator, and we support early stage startups across different sectors. And definitely diversity and inclusion is something where our journey in it has really grown, especially in the past 1.5 to 2 years. And there are kind of, if I had to sum it up, there would be three areas in which there's essentially been capacity building and where our strategy has been. The first is, of course, increasing access to capital to women-led entrepreneurs or enterprises impacting women and girls. The second has been, of course, measuring and better understanding the impact that's actually taking place on the women beneficiaries, beneficiaries from minority communities, unreached geographies, and so on. And the third, of course, is the internal workplace equity at Wilgrow, because we think it's important that you have to walk the talk. So in terms of metrics, also looking at what is gender composition of our board, our team, leadership positions, and really kind of working on that as we work along other initiatives. So yeah, so these are essentially kind of the three main things that we look at.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so very much. And then Kelly, I'm going to ask you to share your perspectives in your work at Palladium, but specifically there again is you've worked in different capacities over many years. What are the key areas today that's standing out for you?
Thanks, Monique. So I have worked about 10 years ago, almost a decade ago, I moved from working in sort of academic research space focused on women to working in the space I do now. So now I'm an associate director at Palladium Impact Capital, which is an advisor for impact investors or investees who are seeking impact capital. So like you said, Monique, I work on kind of both sides of the capital stack. And that gives us a perspective on how to do inclusive measurement, which has been a focus of our work over the last decade, which has started with gender lens investing, but moved on to other more intersectional approaches to how socially conscious impact can be done. So that perspective across demand and supply of capital has given us a chance at Palladium to see what kind of trends are happening over the last decade. And the one that makes me most excited for traffic moving forward is the trend towards standing on the shoulders of others. It's more and more common, and of course, it's more and more possible because of standardization efforts like the 2X Challenge, if we think about gender lens investing, IMP, of course, the GINS navigating impact themes, which I already mentioned in the quiz. And it's more possible today because of techniques that are gaining popularity, even if they're not standardization efforts necessarily. So for example, the lean data approach, a technique for listening to clients, or techniques for listening to staff, like the META GEM, the Gender Equality Mainstreaming Framework, which is basically a participatory audit for thinking internally at businesses, including investors. But there are some negative trends too, of course. So one kind of red light for me is that impact measurement is not yet helping investees increase their impact all that much. So investors have been thinking for years about how to not overburden their investees with reporting, and that's improving. But we also need to think about how measurement can benefit them. Right now, IMM is signaling investors' priorities, and that's a start. But in several studies that Palladium Impact Capital has done in the last year, we found that nearly 100% of investees say that they never hear back from investors about the social metrics that they report. Almost 100%. It's shocking, right? So they don't know how investors analyze that information, and they're not getting any help to understand what to do with their own data. So let's say a fund of funds uses an inclusive measurement technique with their investee, which is a fund, and then that fund cascades the reporting down to their investees, which are enterprises. So the inclusive measurement is working. It's cascading all the way through the capital chain. It's working, but it's not helping. In an important sense, it isn't helping. So I'd encourage investors to think about how metrics can help investees do positive screening for whatever kind of work they're doing. Do your metrics help investees understand how to find new clients or new investees of their own? Do they need a little training from you as an investor to understand how they can use their data? I think once we get that feedback loop right, the inclusive measurement is going to help our impact be more inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. And, I think that what we've had over the last 10 minutes is a very great understanding of the depth of the expertise that all of these panelists bring and the experience set. And we've wonderfully already started touching on our topic for today, which is around building inclusive impact management and measurement systems. And so I wanted to ask really specific questions now to the panelists around that and their expertise. And I've asked them to prepare some really specific thoughts around the issue. As we said in the opening, we really want to give you keys so that in your everyday life, you have some specific areas. And so we're going to talk to some green lights and some red lights. Kelly's already started to allude to that. Areas in your everyday practices that you need to keep doing or pursue doing more of. And similarly, areas from the extensive experience and expertise, we think we should just avoid and stop doing. But specifically when it comes to inclusivity in our social, in our gender areas, how we're measuring it, how we're ensuring those practices are entrenched. I'd like to hear some specific examples of how in your everyday experience, Tanuja, I'm going to ask with you, particularly on the early stage, as a lot of the ANDE specifically participants find themselves in that space. You have seen a green light area which you would want to encourage more practice to happen around, and then a red light area. Thanks, Tanuja.
Sure. So I think a green light would definitely be in terms of metrics, right? At least because that is the focus of this conference as well. Making sure that they're really aligned with the enterprise's priorities, their stage, because as Wilgrow, we work with both early stage product level companies as well as early in market, right? So their needs are really different. So keeping that in mind, and of course, there's sort of 6-month, say, priorities, because an entrepreneur's priorities keep changing, but maybe looking at the next 3 to 6 month priorities and defining metrics aligned with that. And then, of course, keep changing them, right, as their priorities and focuses shift. So I think that would be a green light. And a red would probably be just being really specific again about what those metrics, what kind of value they will create, and then sticking to measuring those. Because I think what might happen is now, because there's so much awareness about different frameworks like SDGs, IRIS, GIN, people do get overwhelmed and they kind of want to show that, hey, yeah, no, we're actually checking a lot of boxes, let's measure this and that. And then that just results in both the investor getting overwhelmed, data not coming in consistently, and then you're not being able to do much with that data. So just being very focused on what are our goals as the investor, what is the entrepreneur's goals, and sticking to measure those specific metrics.
No, I love that. Thank you so much. Mabinti, over to you.
Yeah, I resonated with the points that Tanuja made, because it's really critically important to have alignment, particularly between investors and investees in terms of metric selection. I think a green light is having consultations with your investee to really understand that we're measuring what matters and that we're measuring impact, both positive and negative, that can inform kind of better decision making. So I think that's critically important, and making sure they're clear what the intentions are, and that we're not just trying to measure everything just because they're available, but being really specific in terms of how will we measure it in order to understand our impact on people and planet. I would say the Impact Management Project Convention has been a go-to resource that I use, and many IMM practitioners and investors are using. But I think that it's important to ensure that your investees are clear on what is a kind of a way of harmonize the way we understand and talk about impact. because there are a number of frameworks out there, but making sure that there's clarity. I think another green light is also providing technical assistance to investees to ensure that, one, there's capacity, that there's also learning and understanding and training on how to do proper impact measurement and management, and really understanding the cultural context in which they're investing in. And so I think that's critically important. In terms of red light, I hope as an industry, we'd stop doing this top-down approach in terms of impact measurement and management. Oftentimes I hear from fund managers and investors that we have 10 metrics and we want our investees to measure against this, not really understanding where investees are, their capacity, and just being understanding of what are the metric sets that are most important, what are the metrics that matter. And also I think the red light is not just doing surface level data collection and analysis. Like when we talk about gender smart investing, we need to really start talking a bit more about intersectionality. Not just the number of women, where women show up, but are we reaching historically marginalized women? How are we affecting African women and other women of color, women from different socioeconomic statuses? And so I think being more thoughtful and really scrutinizing more deeply so that, one, we can create better visibility of the financing and knowledge gaps, and then we can work together to address them in a meaningful way.
Binti, and that's so useful. And you started talking to specific metrics and specific areas on the who,
Yeah.
And the much of that we're wanting to measure. But do you have any other specific examples, whether it's other social equity, not just in gender, but even further in gender, that you can share with the rest of the attendees in terms of ones you've come across, which you felt really useful and instructive to ensure that better decisions are made? And then I'm going to ask the other panelists as well, because I think it'll be very useful to just get the broad spectrum of specific metrics that you've come across.
Yeah, I think for me, for a specific project that I've been working on through our Live Africa team is looking at the informal market. So going deeply and looking at, women who are divorced and have businesses versus women who are married. And then looking at where women are living in terms of the resources that they have available to them. We found that there are interesting insights where women who are divorced experience a different set of challenges and circumstances that may be difficult in terms of accessing resources. So maybe even looking at where women are in terms of their life and their household and their life planning, and then also in terms of race. And I know that's race and ethnicity, how that plays a role in one's ability to get access to resources. So if you are from a historically marginalized community, or if you are a refugee and you're a woman, those are a different set of experiences. Another set of circumstances or metrics to consider is if investors have this mandate to invest in women-led or women-owned businesses. When you look at my experience looking in Kenya, some of the companies that are women-led that are getting more financing are ones that are created by expats compared to African women-led businesses. So how are those dynamics impacting access to capital? And then how are those dynamics also influence the ability to realize impact and having entrepreneurs who have a bit more room to actually deliver? So there are a number of different factors, and I think it's really probing more deeply, not just, yes, I want to invest in women, but also how are those investing affecting different types of women in rural communities versus women who live in cities. So I think that's really, really critical to kind of probe and kind of dig deeper when we disaggregate our data sets.
No, that's so wonderful, and it's so useful, such deep insights. And Tanuja, from your side, on the metrics side, because you work very specifically with the entrepreneurs, is there anything in addition that you found that's been really useful, perhaps on the social equity side?
Right. So again, in terms of access, right, to capital to entrepreneurs, so when we're selecting enterprises for incubation, definitely looking at team composition, both in the leadership aspect as well as the general team, what is the ratio of male to female employees. Then in terms of the actual sort of impact measurement, we do carry out these case studies, which are essentially a detailed analysis of the beneficiaries and what sort of change, right, has access to this innovation led to their lives. So one important indicator there is really looking at who in that household is the economic purchaser, right, of things, because a lot of our innovations especially tend to be hardware or machinery, and there's often stigma and kind of lack of agency that women in India have in deciding purchases of such things. So really looking at when you're counting your beneficiary, one, who is that beneficiary, what is their gender, what is the household disaggregate, right? How many women are there in the household? Are they a part of contributing to deciding if this product or service is used? And then, of course, this ties up eventually, right, to things like if we talk about business value, marketing, strategy, product refinement, because if you really understand who's actually using your product, that makes a difference in how you provide the service. So.
No, that's so useful. Thank you so very much. And Kelly, I'm going to come to you now, and I just wanted to flag to the panelists the questions, which I'll pass on in a second. But Kelly, do you want to spend a moment and just reflect? We've spoken quite a bit about the metrics, but specifically some of the barriers which you started to allude in your opening discussion, but some of the barriers you see particularly around the inclusive measurement systems where you work more systematically across the capital change, and what some of the green lights and red lights you see in that area.
Thanks, Monique. So one of the things that I've been thinking about as we're talking here is, so I sit on the content team of the Gender Smart Investing Summit, specifically thinking about how to build capacity of investors. And one of the things that we've been seeing there as a barrier, but I'll say a red light that's turning green, optimistically, is thinking about how do we make sure that what we measure is useful and clear. Tanuja was already alluding to this. And I think that's a real barrier for many investors who have another impact focus. So let's say their focus is on combating climate change. How can we expect that these people are also experts in understanding how to do social impact measurement? Right? I mean, that kind of concern that I hear coming from investors that we don't really know how to do it, and I've got, my job is hard enough kind of reaction, that's a really serious concern that needs some capacity building, and that barrier is important and not just an attitudinal problem, right? It's a real practical problem. So where I see the light turning green, though, is a change in thinking about how do we approach adding social impact metrics? Is it just another priority that gets layered on? And I think there's a little bit of a trend moving away from that, right? And rather thinking about, the starting point is, how does impact measurement or inclusive measurement support the investor narrative that you're already telling? So what I mean by that is, what is the impact story you're already giving for the impact priorities you already have? And then thinking about how inclusiveness fits into that story that's already there. So what is the impact that you're trying to have? Who are the multiple groups that you're approaching and that you want to experience that impact? Why are you doing that work now specifically? What's the urgency around the group or groups? And how, and this is the nitty-gritty of what investors do every day, how do you use the tools in your toolbox to reach out to multiple target groups? So being able to articulate that kind of story, that narrative in a sentence, goes a long way to figuring out what you specifically, you as an investor, should measure. Not what everyone else does, but what is going to support your own story. So I think it's not about adding additional priorities. It's about, the trick is really, how does social inclusion support the what, how, why of what you're already doing as an investor.
Yeah, that's so important. And that it's such a sobering and I think a realistic context to say that, you know, it's not just investees on the ground that need capacity training and capacity building, but also investors. And I think that's fair to expect them to be specialists in every field. But how do we make the system work better for better information at the end of the day and higher quality inclusion across all the various areas that one needs to consider. And Kelly, I'm gonna turn to you for the first question that's come through, which has been around how do we ensure that if we consider women on the ground making organizations, that there's beneficiary driven indicator setting. You've spoken to that quite a bit. I think you've all touched on it, so the other panelists do weigh in. And the specific ask here is so that beneficiaries aren't just reporting on what the investor said, but really giving the opportunity for impact to be visible. And so Kelly, do you want to just kick us off on that one, and then panelists perhaps just raise your hands if you want to do it.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I think I want to build on a point that Mobinti already made, which is that it really can't just be about counting the number of people who come into the room. And we all have seen how that approach has not really helped drive a lot of impact, and it certainly has ignored intersectionality. So what people really are experiencing on the ground, like you said, is a problem when we do it that way. So one thing that I do think is relatively new and that can help move away from that perspective is thinking about process metrics. And Criterion Institute published over the summer, I want to say July, an interesting report about how to do that. So what kind of process metrics to use. But essentially what we're talking about here is measuring not just who gets in the room, but what happens in the room. And I don't mean a metaphorical room. I mean, literally the room where you do due diligence. How do people who make it to the room experience the due diligence that investors do? And that is an important thing that we can measure, but more importantly, that we can investigate. How does it feel? And what kind of problems that we might not be recognizing yet from counting can we find by thinking about how the process actually works day to day?
Yeah, that's so insightful. I love that. Who's actually in the room with the due diligence? It's so helpful. Big green light there. Was there any other responses from the other panelists? Otherwise, I'm going to jump on to the next question I wanted to throw out. Maybe I'm looking to you, Tanuja, for this one. But if you're looking at early stage organizations, how are you addressing resource constraints? Because I think it's so relevant. There's also a question on practically the training and capacitating that can help in this area. And so what has been the challenges that you've seen that have been helpful in addressing that? Because it is an endemic problem for entrepreneurs anyway. And now we want to add a layer almost of responsibility on their shoulders for social equity. But how have you seen that being innovatively resolved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, again, I will sort of respond to that by saying that the alignment is really important, because the more you ensure that the metrics are aligned to the operations or the data they're already collecting, the more easier you're making it, right, for the entrepreneur to kind of accept this. And of course, as an incubator, our goal as well is to do whatever we can in that period of incubation of 1 year, 2 years, and then hoping that those practices stick on. So definitely the alignment. The second would also be so one thing that we do at Will Grow is, of course, while we would love to do more in-depth measurement and research for all our portfolio companies, that's not possible. So we typically choose a few sort of impact champions, companies who are really creating large scale impact or have done that very quickly. And then we onboard an external evaluation partner and we carry out a study. And now in this study, we ensure that the entrepreneur, right, and their team, maybe they have a person who specifically looks at data in the team, right, that they're really involved in the entire stage, from the design to the surveys to the sampling, and then of course in actually analyzing the results. So the idea is that if you do this sort of really high touch, one time, slightly, requires a little bit of investment, engagement, you'll be able to really get some solid insights, which should again, convince the entrepreneur that, hey, there's tangible value in this. And from this sort of in-depth study, maybe there are these few practices which I can keep doing, which are cost effective and yet giving value.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And then, Binti, I'm going to ask you just to reflect. There's a question again that's come through. What has been the meaningful practices for actually measuring inclusivity that you've come across? I know you've started to give some great examples, but perhaps we can stretch you to dig a bit deeper on the reflections you've seen. You've worked across multiple continents and contexts on what you've seen as really meaningful and effective.
Yeah, and I think some of these practices have been stated by both Kelly and Tanuja in terms of like being thoughtful about who you're seeking to reach out to. When we talk about historically marginalized, it's looking at income. We're looking at even across, if you're focused in certain regions, looking at the LGBTQ plus community. Where are there pockets where we're not kind of reaching or understanding the experiences of others? And then kind of co-creating or coming up with a set of metrics to kind of work with investors. So for example, as Live Africa, our team works with an investor based in Kenya. And their intention was to allocate impact capital to really affect positively women who are taking care of their families. So you have the factor of unpaid cared work, who also are the drivers of generating income for their families. What are the best impact products? And then what are the best metrics? So you can come up with a healthy list of questions in order to understand impact, but what are the key questions that are also relevant to the people or beneficiaries or women in this case, that will be helpful for them to make decisions. I think Kelly mentioned at the top of the conversation that sometimes it's, collecting information from investees and then they report back and what happens to that information. So I think it's really throughout the process, kind of working closely with the entrepreneur and then valuing women to say, we want to partner with you as we understand the impact. So there is value across the board. There's buy-in and understanding why this is important, that it's not just this exercise of extracting information from you and producing a glossy report, but it's actually really meaningful in terms of how you can use that information thoughtfully to improve the outcomes in your community, to improve financial inclusion, and knowing where we can, where investors can kind of partner with other organizations to address related issues. I think that there are many ways of doing this, and it's based on the region and based on who you're seeking to serve, and also engendering trust between investors and investees, or even women as consumers, women as entrepreneurs, women in leadership, the 2X kind of framework, essentially, kind of how are we looking at being thoughtful and engaging women across the value chain and recognizing that the voices of women matter, regardless of whether you're an entrepreneur or a consumer or a community stakeholder, that their voices matter enough for us to really engage in a meaningful way. And then again, if you're talking about women who have companies in the early stages, kind of what are the resources that are available to them? There are a number of African incubators. I can speak to the work of, for example, Village Capital, and support of the next gen Africa ecosystem building that provides resources through working with advisors to help entrepreneurs and help African incubators and accelerators better improve the way they articulate and measure impact. As well as other areas that they're challenged to improve the way they service entrepreneurs on the ground. There are also, other resources for early stage, like looking at, again, Iris Plus, I'm a bit biased around IS Plus, I must admit, having worked at the GIN, but also, again, the Impact Management Project. There's so much, many resources that kind of identify great best practices for entrepreneurs as well as investors to really harmonize the way they talk about impact, to provide a clear process in terms of how you engage women in the community, and how you engage people who are from historically marginalized community or low resource communities who are in need of support. So I think those are publicly available resources that I find to be go-to, and I identify practices and case studies to support work wherever you're investing in.
Yes, that's brilliant. And I think that's such a valid point. Thanks for reminding us, is that there's so much publicly available online resources that gives detailed case studies and practical how-to steps, examples of other organizations that have done it. But I think that the challenge lies still, correct me if I'm wrong, in the hidden practices that still excludes so much of the population. And I'm gonna put you on the spot a bit, Kelly, with that difficult question, as we have 5 minutes to conclude, and then and perhaps then just to flag to the panelists, I'm going to ask you each to jump in, because I think we've touched on a lot of the questions that have come through already. So as your concluding remark, Kelly, I think let's get really real and honest that there's still a lot of hidden subtleties. We may be a well-diversified all-woman panelists here, but the reality is that's not the case when we go back into the organizations for most attendees. And if you think of the hidden subtleties that need to be addressed, what is the big green light you would encourage each one participant? For me, that having worked in both an NGO organization, large-scale asset manager, corporate, is to never stop asking the difficult questions, especially when you're faced with executive management, just because it creates a little bit of tension. And I think if we all hold ourselves honest in the organizations we are all the time, and not get stuck in comfort zone and not ask the difficult questions just because it's a bit uncomfortable, perhaps we would be in a different place today. And I would say that would be my green light for those that have been courageous and asked the difficult questions, to continue to do that. But I'm going to ask you, Kelly, in the subtle hidden challenges we know still exist, because we still have a big mountain to climb when it comes to inclusivity, what are the areas you would leave the attendees with to do?
Thank you. Yes, it is difficult to think about this stuff, but so necessary, right? One of the things that comes to mind is in our beginning of our journey, really, in thinking about LGBTQ lens investing, and identity, or an intersectional identity that can be invisible and it can be illegal in a lot of the places where we work. So one of the things that we've started to think about there that really is applicable across many communities, and which is hidden and hard to ask, is thinking about your partners. So I feel like it may be a green light listening to Mabinti and Tanuja talk about partnerships where you clearly have thought about how aligned you are with your partners. And I would encourage other investors to think about that, really having those hard conversations, and maybe even thinking about doing a little measurement, right? Because nobody sits in this ecosystem alone. Certainly not investors. There's lawyers around us. There's consultants around us. If you provide or recommend TA, if you work with Accelerator, I mean, all those things are around you. And if you are perfect and everyone you recommend and work with is undermining your social inclusion goals, investees don't experience that differently. That's still coming from you, and it's still a part of an ecosystem that you're, supporting, or you can support to be better. So asking your partners about what kind of training they've had is, I think, a really important step.
Wonderful, thank you. Tanuja, your closing comments.
So I definitely agree with what both you, Monique and Kelly, mentioned about asking the right questions. And I think asking better questions, the more that you do collect disaggregated data, it improves the quality of the conversations you can have. So definitely keep doing that. And the second, because it also came up with the Q&A, is about resource constraints. So again, questioning your donors, right? So either aligning with donors who already have a strong gender inclusion mandate and a strong vision with that. And maybe even if they don't, to kind of work on instilling those practices and that mindset, with your colleagues, with the everyday data that you're looking at, just looking at disaggregate in terms of gender, community, geography, as much as you can. And then kind of making a case, right, to your funders and investors that this is the way we do things. So, we would like to kind of continue doing this with your support. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And Mabinti.
Yeah, thank you. I think Monique, I would echo the sentiment of the hard questions, and Kelly and Tanuja made really great points about kind of really understanding, what type of impact you want to achieve, to really ask more deeper question, even when we talk about gender and reaching women. I would also be thoughtful about partnering and working with your investees to understand kind of how people are actually experiencing either investment or some of the interventions that you're deploying in a specific market. Be thoughtful in terms of how you identify metrics, make sure that it matters both to the investors and the investees, and also really think about, again, people and planet. And I know the IMP convention really brings that to the fore. And I think it's just really being thoughtful about that. I know that there's this a grander intention to align to the SDGs. There are definitely resources to do so. I know IRIS Plus includes a whole linkage of how the IRIS over 600 metrics align to the SDGs. So that could be a great resource in terms of understanding what impact we want to achieve. And then also really scrutinizing kind of the measurements that you're doing. Are we actually reaching people who are historically underserved? Are we doing enough? And if we aren't, and there are gaps, again, partnerships are a great tool and resource. And there are a number of data collection tools that are helpful and that, you should really consider the full engaging more deeply with some of the incubators and accelerators to really be in alignment. So again, it's an ecosystem effort, as Kelly mentioned, and I think that we can be better and be braver. I think society calls for us to do so in this time of heightened political tensions, as the US has its last election day, and diversity and inclusion affects everything. So let's not think of it as a last minute, but just be intentional about doing it, because I think there's a lot of opportunities and ways that we can optimize impact.
That's brilliant. Thank you so very much. What a wonderful note to conclude on. Thank you to all the panelists. It's been a joy and a privilege to share this time with you all. We are at time. I'm trying to just paste in there my notes from the green light, red lights. There you go. For those that are interested, you can copy paste a summary of it because we are at time. But I will pull out just one green light for me. I think that's come through consistently, is to be deliberate about aligning regularly, whether you're partnering with an investor or with a donor, a foundation. Ensure that you understand well what their priorities are both ways, for the investor and for the investees, when you're selecting specific metrics. And that alignment and partnering, I think, has come through so strongly as a green light. And then the red light, I think, specifically has been shallow for me, shallow conversations, shallow analysis of metrics, to really dig deeper using the information we have, ensuring the questions are real and deliberate. And so hopefully that's been a useful session for you all. Thank you very much. I think at that point we need to end.